in the schools, and then you had sort of second and third tier public colleges, state universities, community colleges, who felt we have to teach the high school teachers who teach world history. So they started to offer world history so that their graduates could have some background when they went and got a job teaching high school. Well, it turned out their professors had no background in world history. So then there was a thought, well, maybe the universities that produce PhDs should teach people to teach world history. And very gradually, world history has gone from being in the schools and worked its way up to being now at Columbia. I don't think Harvard teaches this. I'm pretty sure Princeton doesn't. And they may not do it after this year, who knows? But it's a fascinating example of the way in which history is built not on just intellectual achievement or vision, but also on matters of politics and ideology. This is a course that is heavily rooted in issues of politics and ideology. Every year in the summer, this past year was in Fort Collins, Colorado, hundreds of teachers gather for a week or two to grade the AP exams. This year was 870 high school teachers flew out to Colorado, and I think they had to grade several hundred exams apiece. And a close friend of mine, I've known people who've done it. I haven't done it, never will. But my friend said, it was like a cult. These people live world history. They look down on other forms of history. World history is what it is. And yet, there's no real clarity as to what world history actually is. So, to some degree, it's an ideology. If you had to define it as an ideology or as a philosophy, in my view, what I'd say is that world history, in the way that it is being thought of by people who identify themselves as world historians, members of the World History Association, which, unlike other academic associations, is about 50% high school teachers and 50% college professors. What they are doing, they might define as the antidote to the Columbia Core curriculum. Now, for the last 80 years or so, we have had a core curriculum at Columbia that has assumed a certain quasi-divine quality for the Western civilization accomplishment at its highest level. And we teach that in CC and Lit Hum, Art Hum, Music Hum. All of these are worthy courses. I have no objection to the Columbia Core curriculum. In fact, I'm the only member of the faculty who's actually taught all 4 of those courses. And yet, there is no way that you can tweak the Columbia Core curriculum to include the rest of the world. You cannot say, oh, this year we're going to include Ibn Khaldun, or a passage from Mencius or Gilgamesh, and therefore we have the whole world covered. Because your standard of comparison remains the Western Civ core. Beyond that, the structure of the Columbia Core curriculum assumes that the proper way to study cultures over time is through literary texts or artistic monuments of one sort or another. In other words, the core curriculum is strongly biased against popular history, social history, economic history, quantitative history, all of these areas that do not depend upon the great works. We have the conceit that there's a sort of conversation among all the great thinkers that, you can sit in class and imagine, well, what would St. Augustine say to Martin Luther or John Rawls or something like that? That's total baloney, but it's the conceit that keeps the thing going. That you imagine that this is a great conversation. World history tends to avoid the peaks of high culture, both because they're trying to decenter the narrative and get it away from Europe, and because the problem with any high cultural text is that in an American school system, people are always looking for the European analog. You know, what is the Bhagavad Gita like in Western history? What are the analogs of Confucius like? And so forth. So the world historians tend to use different principles than the people who designed and devoted their careers to things like the Columbia Core Curriculum. Nowadays, we have a lot of debate over the core curriculum about how to and whether to tweak it to be international, and my own view is that that cannot work, and that you have to actually move out of that house and moved into another one. Maybe that one's made of bricks and this one's made of twigs. Nevertheless, we're moving with the piggies into a different house in a course like this. So what do we do in a course like this? Well, in the first place, there are three different levels at which you can think about world history. And to some degree, I want to use this course to introduce all three. The first is as a narrative. When you finish this course, particularly if you take both semesters, you will know everything that happened of importance in the entire history of the world. And, you might as well drop out of college after that, because what more is there to know? Actually, that won't happen. The problem is that the narrative is a colossal grand compromise that comes out of the whole history of curriculum design, combined with the interests of textbook publishers. What distinguished world history from American history was that everyone could assume that a high school teacher teaching American history actually knew something about American history before the course began and could read a textbook and sort of understand it and augment it through their own additional reading and experience. The opposite assumption was true in world history. The assumption was that the teacher knows nothing and everything must be in the textbook. This put enormous power in the hands of the textbook publishers. And the textbook publishers have progressively abandoned the Western Civ augmented approach and adopted a sort of a pan-global perspective that tries to give balance to all parts and all periods. This has not been wildly successful educationally, but it is phenomenally successful if you're lucky enough to be an author. I happen to be lucky enough to be an author, and it has allowed me to lead a life over the last 10 years or so very different from what my Columbia salary would have permitted. Because the teachers are so dependent on the textbooks that if you have a successful textbook, you sell many, many thousands of units, and you fight off your competition, you struggle for market share, and so forth and so on. Very tedious, but fortunately very lucrative. And one of the things that you discover is that when you write this narrative, you're not writing history in the way you would if you were writing